Well, it's really nice to be here, and thank you for the invitation. It's been fantastic to hear about all the work that's done. So my name's Kyle Whyte, and I'm a professor at Michigan State University. I work in two departments, in the Department of Philosophy and the Department of Community Sustainability, and I'm part of our American Indian and Indigenous Studies program. I'm a Potawatomi tribal member, and I'm enrolled in the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, which is in Oklahoma. You know, if you go to like a museum or if you look in a lot of different books, you get a very detailed account of sort of European history in North America, and then the establishment of the US and Canada, and then this sort of very small, relatively speaking, simplistic portrayal of what indigenous people were doing. So one thing that I'm particularly fascinated about is that for Anishinaabe people, which is the group that I'm part of, so I'm a member of the Potawatomi tribe, and we're part of the larger Anishinaabe group, which includes Odawa and Ojibwe people. So our governance system, or at least our heritage of governance, was entirely seasonally based. And our society was actually organized to adjust and shift to the dynamics of the different seasons throughout the year. And by seasons, I don't necessarily mean 4 seasons. There were 13 different moons along the lunar cycle, and depending on the community, there might be 6 or 7 additional ways to divide up the year in terms of, you know, what in English we might call seasons. And what is particularly important about that is the actual institutions changed in shape and size depending on what the season was. So if you were harvesting, you know, toward the end of the winter maple, the actual governance institution would be the family. If you were fishing during the summer, the actual governance unit would be a larger band structure that might have a chief. And these shifts would occur at least 13, probably more times a year. What we've also found in that work, which I think is extremely important, is that people actually understood the ecosystem as a moral ecosystem. So plants and animals were considered to have a kind of agency and responsibility to humans. Humans were supposed to have a responsibility back to plants and animals, but also entities such as water. And what's particularly important about that is that the responsibilities were reciprocal. So I have to do my part, and the plants and animals, they have to do their part. And if we don't pay attention to how well all of us are observing our responsibilities, then we're going to have problems in society. And so what is another kind of implication of this way of thinking is that it was seasonal. It was based on moral responsibility. It was also a very fluid society. And so by fluid, I mean that people believed that the way in which the world worked was that it was constantly changing, and it was our responsibility to adapt to those changes. And one of the key areas actually where we get sort of this dynamism is with gender. So for Anishinaabe people, our gender system was not only a system that was characterized by respect for people today who are coded as women, but also for Two-Spirit people, people that were
coded as both.
Coded as both, people that today might refer to themselves as non-binary in gender. And so women, for example, were in all sorts of different leadership roles and had responsibilities for particular plants, animals, for entities like water. And it was also a society in which women were not primarily defined in terms of their marriage to a man. In fact, what was important about, say, being a woman at that time was your relationships with all the other family members or members in your society. And actually, if you look at the history of, especially of US colonialism in the late 1700s, early 1800s, some of the evidence we have actually shows that when the US began introducing patriarchy, you know, first as a diplomatic strategy, and then as a set of values that they wanted to install within indigenous people, that our ancestors were quite horrified when they realized that US sexism meant that women could not negotiate on behalf of Anishinaabe people. They were actually quite surprised and shocked, and actually thought that that was a ridiculous way to engage in governance. On the one hand, Indigenous Studies Scholarship has really made some key breakthroughs in how we understand both the history of gender, but also the contemporary situation we face with sexual violence and other gender justice issues. And so I do get a chance to see that other fields have begun to take account of that. On the other hand, I still regularly meet academics who I don't think understand Indigenous accounts of gender. And one of the key debates actually is whether Indigenous people want to identify as feminists, or whether feminism is actually confining of Indigenous thought, and say Indigenous thought is broader than what some people might understand feminism to be.
What do you think about this kind of museum, this kind of, or responsibility? Do you think we have responsibilities to help to think the world anew? Or some people say that a museum like this is old-fashioned and should close, that there's no utility for them anymore. So what would you say about an institution like this, especially from the perspective of Indigenous scholarship? Yeah,
so that's a great question, and the way I approach it is to make sort of two different points, and each point is a goal that many Indigenous people have. So for many Indigenous people, we're both at a point where we're trying to recreate, redesign our own institutions that do things like express our history, allow us to express our cultures, but also allow us to share when appropriate with other people. So that's one priority that Indigenous people have. Another priority, which many Indigenous people share too, is that we're trying to reform and change the institutions of dominant groups. In North America, oftentimes we refer to the United States and Canada, but the Netherlands as well is a dominant group, and obviously that has colonial heritage in North America. And so both of these projects are very important for Indigenous people to pursue, both self-determination in creating our own and strengthening our own institutions, but then reforming the dominant institutions. And this is where I think we can begin to understand why the work of museums is important, but also how it could be changed. In terms of the first goal, I would be curious to see the ways in which museums could use their resources and their expertise to work with tribal groups so that tribes in their own homelands could strengthen their own capacity to share their culture with others, to practice their culture, and to tell their own histories. And so that might be something that occurs primarily within Indigenous territories. But this is part of the project of what we often call Indigenous Resurgence, which is bringing back our own culture and making it acceptable and appropriate for us to practice those cultures and to tell those histories. I would love to see installations and museum work that actually reflected the perspective of a people that see their history and their current situation through the lens of constant motion. And the history of, for example, Indigenous women who don't see patriarchy or the suppression of women as the historic norm that it's just now that we're fighting against, but a women's history actually that comes from that Indigenous approach, where we have hundreds and hundreds of years of gender equality, of respect for the different important things that people of different genders do in society, and this very recent, over the last 100 to 200 years, disruption of that, and then Indigenous women's leadership in addressing issues of gender and sexual violence. And so I think when you look in detail at what it would mean to create, a space, an exhibit, coming out of that perspective, it would just be radically different than what is normal.
It is a philosophical project, right? A bigger philosophical project. and that our collections are, every single object is a kind of way of knowing, a way of being in the world, and that through that we can help others to understand that the world, there are other ways of being and knowing in the world. My last question to you is, why philosophy? Why did you do philosophy?
So the field of philosophy actually began to catch my attention because a lot of what philosophers do is talk about justice.
Yeah. Okay, right.
You know, and actually justice, the idea of justice is a way in which I actually try to understand a lot of the issues that we were talking about earlier. So for example, from an Indigenous perspective, I would argue that at least one way of thinking about justice is looking at how processes of colonization, both historically and today, actually undermined Indigenous people's capacity to live sustainably with the environment. And so you have these processes where one society actually seeks to use another society's land for the sake of feeding its own sustainability, though we've seen now that the dominant societies didn't actually have a very good approach to sustainability. But while they were doing this, they actually then weakened Indigenous people's sustainability. And so what you see today with issues like climate change is that Indigenous people are affected more by climate change relative to other groups in terms of harms they might face. But the reason why is actually not because they're simply living in the wrong place at the wrong time. Actually, the reason why most Indigenous people, according to the evidence we have, are at greater risk from climate change is because their institutions, the area of land that they live on, has been so transformed by colonization that they don't have the types of capacities that historically they actually would have had and would have been able to successfully have adapted to the types of issues that now are a problem. And so to me this is an issue of justice.
That is interesting because one of the things that we push now in our research programming is actually to ask these questions about justice, is to ask the question about how what kind of reparative frameworks do we imagine or can imagine anew with our collections, and how can we participate in that.